time for the exciting conclusion to Who Was Sojourner Truth? Bell gave notice. That meant she was quitting her job. The next morning, June 1st, 1843, she walked down to the ferry and paid 2 shillings, which was about 25 cents to get on. She was on her way east to Connecticut. All she carried was a pillowcase. By the time evening came, she was far outside the city. She stopped at the home of a Quaker to ask for water. The woman asked her name. She said her name was Sojourner. A sojourner is a traveler, someone who never stays in one place very long. And that's what Sojourner planned to do. She was setting out to be a traveling preacher. The woman asked her second name. Sojourner hesitated. She'd never had a second name. She'd always been Hardenberg's Bell or Dumont's Bell. She was called by the name of her owners. These were slave names. What was her name? Then it came to her. She was devoting herself to God's word, and God's word was true. She told the woman her second name was Truth. Her new name fit her new life, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner was 46 when she took her new name and started her new life. That's how old I am. She spent the summer and fall preaching in New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. People came to hear her at churches and at outdoor meetings. By the winter of 1843, she was tired. She needed a rest. She joined a new community in western Massachusetts. It was called the Northampton Association of Education and Industry. Blacks and whites lived and worked together in the association. They ran a silk factory and lived on the money made from selling silk. Many were abolitionists. Sometimes they invited famous speakers to give talks. One was William Lloyd Garrison. Another was Frederick Douglass. Like Sojourner Truth, Douglass had been a slave. He spoke and wrote about his experiences. Sojourner also heard speakers talk about women's rights. In the 1840s, women could not vote or own property. They could not pass laws or act as leaders. Many people thought being a wife and mother was the only role for a woman. Very few paying jobs were open to them. Women's rights supporters had different ideas. They believed women and men should be equal under the law. In 1846, the Northampton Association ran out of money and closed. Sojourner was sad. She went back to working for white people. But she was fired up by all the speakers she'd met. She'd become friendly with Olive Gilbert, who was also a member of the Northampton Association and an early supporter of women's rights. Olive told Sojourner about the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. Sojourner began to think about women's rights and her life as a former slave. Frederick Douglass had written about his life in slavery. Now Olive encouraged Sojourner to do the same. Sojourner still did not know how to write, but she had dictated letters to Peter. So Sojourner dictated her life story to Olive. William Lloyd Garrison printed it. He also wrote an introduction. Narrative of Sojourner Truth, a Northern Slave, was published in 1850. That same year, Sojourner paid to have a small house built in Northampton. It cost $300. She borrowed the money. She'd repay it from the sales of her book. This house would give her something she never had before, peace and security. Sojourner's book did not sell well. People did not know her name yet. She was not as famous as Frederick Douglass. Sojourner kept going to abolitionist meetings and tried to sell her books after the meetings. At one meeting in late 1850, Sojourner was invited to speak. This was a surprise. She'd not known she would be asked, but she did not want to say no. She began with a hymn she had written. Then she told her story. She talked about her life as a slave. She spoke of her father's death, of being beaten, of losing Peter. When she was done, everyone cheered. Many people cried. She sold lots of books that night and was able to set aside money to help pay for her house. After that meeting, she decided she would go on more speaking tours. She could sell her book after her speeches. That was a good way to earn a living. In 1851, Sojourner spoke at a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio. That's where LeBron James is from. Hundreds of people were there. Some supported women's rights, but many did not. Speakers got up and gave their speeches. Would Sojourner be one of them? Was not certain. Some women's rights supporters did not want her to speak. They did not want the abolitionist issue and the women's rights issue to get mixed up. They argued it was better to keep the two issues separate, but in the end, Sojourner got up to give a speech. Sojourner was calm when she spoke. Her voice was deep and powerful. Her words made her audience sit up and listen. Here is some of what she said. I have plowed and planted and gathered in barns, and no man could heed me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. That's like a whip. And ain't I a woman? I have borne children and seen all sold off into slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? At first the crowd was silent. Then there was cheering and applause. It was a great moment for Sojourner. She had stood up and spoken her truth. All black people and all women deserved the same rights as white men. People of good conscience had to see this. After this speech, Sojourner's fame grew. People came to meet her. Journalists wrote about her. Even people who did not agree with her respected her. She borrowed a horse and buggy and piled it high with 600 copies of her book. Sojourner rode through Ohio and Indiana making speeches about women's rights and ending slavery. Often, she let her horse choose the direction. She did not worry about food, clothes, or where she would stay. She had her faith. It kept her strong. God would provide. In 1857, when she was 60 years old, Sojourner sold her house in Northampton, Massachusetts. She moved to a small community in Michigan called Harmonia near Battle Creek. Like the Northampton Association, Harmonia was a place where blacks and whites lived side by side. Blacks were treated equally. Many abolitionists lived in the area too. They were proud to have Sojourner as a neighbor, and she was happy to be living among kind-hearted, educated people who were free from prejudice. Sojourner wanted to spend time with their daughters, Diana and Elizabeth, and their sons, James Caldwell and Samuel Banks, who were all living nearby. Sammy was her favorite. He was Elizabeth's son. He did chores for Sojourner. He helped her around the house. When he learned to read, he read the Bible to her. He kept her company. Maybe Sammy reminded her of Peter, the son who sailed away. Sammy and his grandmother became very close. Meanwhile, the question of slavery was tearing the United States apart. By this time, slavery had been outlawed in all the northern states. Many in the North thought slavery should end everywhere in the country. But the southern states still clung to their slaves. Rich Southerners had large farms and needed free labor to plant and harvest crops such as cotton, rice, and tobacco. Although the government passed different laws to deal with the problem and keep the country whole, it was not working. Finally, in 1861, 11 southern states broke away and formed their own country, the Confederate States of America. The Civil War started. Northern soldiers fought against Southern soldiers. One of Sojourner's grandsons, James Caldwell, signed up with the Northern Army. She was so proud. She encouraged other black men to enlist. In 1863, a large group of black soldiers in Detroit was preparing for battle. Sojourner asked the people of Battle Creek, Michigan, to donate food. She brought the food to the soldiers for a Thanksgiving dinner. To encourage the young men, she spoke and sang. She wanted to raise their spirits with her words. Slaves were fleeing from the South and coming to the North. Some joined the army. Others just wanted to make a new life as free men and women. Thousands of these former slaves landed in Washington, D.C. They were free now, but they had no jobs. They had no homes. What would happen to them? Sojourner knew they would need help. She decided to go there and help them. In 1864, she arrived in Washington. What she saw was terrible. Ex-slaves lived in shacks. They did not have enough food or clothing. They did not know how to take care of themselves because they never had to do it before. But Sojourner had. She would show them all the things they needed to know. Her work was noticed and praised. She even got to meet President Abraham Lincoln. What an honor. He signed her book of life, a combination autograph book and scrapbook. She was so proud to have his signature in it. The war raged on for years. Almost 750,000 soldiers lost their lives. Finally, on April 9th, 1865, the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered. The Civil War was over at last, but the South lay in ruins. Houses and property were destroyed. Cities were burned to the ground. It would take years to rebuild. Just a few days after Lee's surrender, President Lincoln went to see a play. While at the theater, he was shot and killed by a pro-Southern actor named John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln's body was laid out in the East Room of the White House. Thousands of people came to mourn and pay their respects. Sojourner and Sammy were among them. Vice President Andrew Johnson became the new president. Sojourner met with him, too. She wanted to talk about the ex-slaves in Washington. She told him her concerns. He listened, but made no promises to help. Sojourner had her book of life with her that day. She did not ask President Johnson to sign it. The war had ended and the slaves were freed, but the newly freed slaves' problems were far from over, and women had not won important freedoms. They still could not vote. Sojourner was almost 70 years old. She was growing tired, but there was still so much work to do. Sojourner knew she had to keep going. Sojourner continued to help the cause by working for the Freedmen's Hospital. It would be her job to promote order, cleanliness, industry, and virtue among the poor blacks who lived there. Being clean was very important to Sojourner. She believed that cleanliness brought a person closer to God. Many of the former slaves had been field hands. That meant they mostly only knew how to do jobs that they learned while working outdoors on farms. After they had not been paid for their years of backbreaking work, how would they build new lives? They were poor and did not have the skills needed for jobs offered in the city. Sojourner thought a lot about this problem, and she was the right person to solve it. Many well-meaning white people could teach skills like sewing or knitting or cooking to former slaves, but Sojourner had been a slave. She knew how these people felt. She understood their problems and their pain. She encouraged them to get an education. She also told them they needed to learn to love white people who had been working for their cause. While she worked at the hospital, Sojourner lived in a house at the Freedmen's Village. Her grandson, Sammy, lived there too. On most days, Sojourner walked to work. At the end of the day, she walked home, but one day she decided to take a streetcar. She waited at the side of the road. 2 cars passed her by. They didn't stop. Finally, she called out in her loud, booming voice. She said she wanted a ride. The 3rd car stopped for her, but the conductor was rude and threatening. He called her names. He made her sit in the back of the car. That was where black people were forced to sit. Sojourner did what she was told, but she was angry. Another time she wanted to ride a streetcar. She went with her friend, her white friend, Laura Haviland. Sojourner tried to get on first. The conductor pushed her aside. He said the white lady should get on first. "I'm a lady too," Sojourner said. This made the conductor furious. He shoved her so hard, he hurt her shoulder badly. Sojourner got off the streetcar, but she did not forget what the conductor had done. She took him to court for hurting her. This was not the first time she had gone to court to accuse a white person, and like the time before, she won. The conductor was fired. Good. After that, other conductors did stop to pick up black people who wanted to ride. Sojourner had won another important battle. But Sojourner's victory did not last. In time, new laws were passed. These laws kept blacks separated from whites. They could not live or go to school together. They could not eat in the same restaurants. The new laws were known as Jim Crow laws. They stayed in effect in the South for a long time, almost 100 years. Sojourner was determined to help former slaves. Around 1867, she got a brilliant idea. The slaves should be paid back for their years of forced labor, but not in money, in land. The government should give free land out west to former slaves. Then they could become farmers. They could use the skills they had. As farmers, they would be productive citizens. They would not need help from anyone. She was very excited about this idea. Her slogan was 20 acres and a mule. In 1868, Sojourner's job at the Freedmen Hospital ended. Now she was able to devote more time to this new cause. Sojourner and Sammy traveled. She spoke out about equal rights for newly freed blacks. She also continued to speak about women's rights. Sojourner returned to Washington, D.C. on March 31st, 1870. She visited President Ulysses S. Grant. He'd recently been elected. She wanted his support for her land grant proposal. The president listened to what she had to say, although the conversation was not written down. However, Sojourner seemed encouraged by his response. She asked him to sign her book of life. And when he ran for a second term, she supported him. But Grant disappointed her. He did not give her the help she expected. So Sojourner took her idea to Congress. She showed up at the Capitol building. In her white cap, gray dress, and white shawl, she looked elegant and proud. Here is part of what she said to the senators. "We have been a source of wealth to this republic. Our labor supplied the country with cotton and furnished employment and support for a multitude, thereby becoming a revenue to the government. Our nerves and our sinews, our tears and our tears and our blood have been sacrificed on the altar of this nation's avarice. Our unpaid labor has been a stepping stone to its financial success. Some of its dividends must surely be ours." Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts was deeply moved by her words. He said he would try to pass a bill if she could prove there was wide support for the plan. Immediately, Sojourner went to work. She had a petition, a document that spelled out what she wanted to get for black people. Underneath was lots of space for signatures. Anyone who signed a petition was agreeing to help her plan. Sammy and another grandson helped. Sojourner and her grandson spent 8 months on the road. They went all through New England. They went to Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, West Virginia, and Washington, D.C. In each of these places, she gave speeches and shared her story. On January 1st, 1871, Sojourner spoke to a crowd at Tremont Hall in Boston. She talked about her childhood, the cellar, the beatings, and the pain of being separated from her family. After hearing her, people were eager to sign the petition. While she was still in Massachusetts, Sojourner heard from her old friend Olive Gilbert. Olive had written down Sojourner's autobiography and was a supporter of women's rights. Now she helped Sojourner get more signatures for the petition. Sojourner was able to gather thousands of signatures. Now it was time to return to Washington. Surely Senator Sumner would see there was support for her idea. She had faith in her promise. He would help her. But when she got there, she learned that the senator had recently died. And so did Sojourner's great idea. No one else believed in it. The government would not give the support she needed. The former slaves would not get their 20 acres and their mule. Discouraged and sad, she went back to Michigan. She was tired and she missed home. Also, Sammy was sick. At first, his illness did not seem serious, but his fever and cough got worse. Sammy died in February 1875. He was only 24 years old. Sojourner missed him terribly. He'd been her constant companion, and he had helped her in so many ways. Now she had no one to read to her and no one to write her letters. She felt so bad. She did not want to go on. Sojourner decided to go home to Battle Creek. She told her family she was going home to die. But Sojourner was wrong. She still had plenty of work to do. Sojourner remained committed to the idea of women's rights. She knew Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, two of the movement's most famous leaders. Stanton and Anthony were focused on voting rights. In order for society to change, women had to be able to vote for new laws. They needed to vote for the leaders they believed in. Without the vote, women had no voice and no power. Black men had been given the right to vote in 1870. Even so, many southern states had found ways, even so, many southern states found ways of preventing them from voting. But black women were even worse off, just as for white women, it was not legal for them to vote. Sojourner agreed with Stanton and Anthony. She went to gatherings and gave speeches about women's rights. She said that women would be good leaders, judges, and lawmakers. Often, she was the only black woman at these gatherings, and she was one of the only movement's leaders who was poor. Most of the leaders in the women's rights movement had money. They did not have to worry about making a living. They did not need to work at all. Because of this, they did not think about the needs of poor women. Sojourner was different. She'd struggled as a black woman, and she'd struggled as a poor woman. She pointed out that men and women were not paid equally for the same work. This made it harder for women to take care of themselves and their families. Sojourner thought that was not fair. She wanted the supporters of women's rights to focus on the issue of equal pay. Until women were paid equally, they would not be equal. Sojourner also believed that women needed to make changes, not just talk about them. She put her beliefs into action. In 1872, she tried to vote in Battle Creek, Michigan. She was turned away. She knew she had to keep fighting, but she did not live to see women get the right to vote. In 1878, Sojourner went on a speaking tour to 36 towns in Michigan. She was 81 years old. In that same year, she was also one of 3 delegates to the Women's Rights Convention in Rochester, New York. This convention was held on the 30th anniversary of the first convention in Seneca Falls. Some progress had been made since the 1848 convention. In 1851, Amelia Jenks Bloomer started a dress reform movement for women. Instead of stiff petticoats and uncomfortable long skirts, she urged women to wear loose pants under shorter skirts. This new costume would make it easier for them to get around. Costume. The pants were named for her, bloomers. I still have heard of that today, bloomers. In 1869, women began serving on juries in the Wyoming Territory. But these were small steps. There was still so much more to be done. Sojourner could no longer do it. She had spent years fighting for the rights of black people. Now she was old and tired. She made one last trip to Kansas. She wanted to speak to former slaves who were planning to go out west and farm the land given to them by the government. Then she returned to Battle Creek for good. Sojourner died on November 26, 1883. She was 86 years old. Her funeral was attended by 1,000 people. She was buried in Oak Hill Cemetery near her grandson, Sammy. A newspaper in Battle Creek wrote, "The country has lost one of its most important personages. But Sojourner Truth's bold spirit lives on. Her work and her words continue to inspire and instruct. She is one of America's great heroes and will always be remembered that way." Wow, what a woman. It's a great book.